Okay. So a couple things. I've gone through and looked at your guys' limits to muscular size assignments. Remember, we're looking for peer-reviewed references to back up our claims. We want to elaborate and make sure that we're fully explaining each of our points. And more importantly, there's a difference between influences and true limits. Okay. So effectively, a limit is effectively the ceiling. We can't go above it. So some folks brought up nutrition. Now, nutrition is a major influencer. Now, if we just decided to let you eat everything you wanted, you had no caloric issues whatsoever, what then becomes the limiting factor of why we can't seem to gain any more lean mass? So think of it along the lines of what are those real, like we don't seem to be able to go past these points. And that seems to come down to the myonuclear domain theory, comes down to perhaps a little bit to be said with capillary density. So you've got to dive down and think about myostatin and other type of signaling pathways in the cell that effectively just shut you down. So obviously training, that's a major influence. Gender, which we're really talking hormones, that's an influence. But that's not necessarily a limiting factor. There's plenty of women that have more muscle than guys. And that's more or less due to genetics and work habits. So let's really think about, okay, what's really going on under the hood? Now, for this week with the lab, it's the wonderful Wingate. You can do the treadmill Wingate on your own, probably at the rec center. You just got to get that thing up to 20% grade and going at 8 or 10 miles an hour and hold on for as long as you want. It's absolutely miserable. Otherwise, you've got the videos online that you can go ahead and look at. And then we're going to go ahead and talk our way through it whenever we meet up on Friday about that. So with all that taken care of, let's go ahead and start going back into our neurological components. So when we're thinking about effectively how we react to different stimuli, just remember that we have this entire pathway. So we have that first stimulus. That could be a visual cue, that could be an auditory cue, that could be a tactile cue. And from there, we then have that signal that's received by the sensory organ. It goes all the way back. Yes, I want you guys to do the lab before we meet on Friday. I mean, I guess I could drag the Wingate, the Monarch bike and everything we need back behind the old rec center, and people could do the Wingates there. But the idea is you're trying to do this lab independently, and you just want to do the treadmill is probably what all of you guys want to go ahead and do, is just run on there as hard as you can, follow the instructions on the lab. And if you guys are really interested in coming in to experience the actual bike Wingate, we can possibly make that work. Just go ahead and email me about it independently, and we'll try to figure out a time that works for you. But we have that stimulus that's received by the actual sensory organ. That is then, that action potential is going into our central nervous system. So we're talking about our cerebrum. It's processed, and from there, we're going to then send out a motor response. And that response is obviously going to go down to our muscles and in turn cause us to react, to contract. And that in turn is going to go ahead and get us to move. Now, each of those steps obviously requires a certain amount of time. And so that's why there's a limit on literally how fast we can perceive information, because like anything else, we're processing the information when it gets to us. And then for that point, we're trying to react to it. And that's where, Lord knows if the Terminator films were accurate, humans would have no shot, because machines are always going to be able to react far, far faster than we can, simply due to the fact that they can process information and send that information even faster than we can. So also the Matrix movies would be pretty fast too, because yeah, machines would just win. Now, this is going to be, we have a number of different points of integration, and this is now when we're talking about reflexes. So we have a little bit going on our spinal cord, our lower brain stem, our cerebellum, our thalamus, and then our cerebral cortex. And this is where we're really making our major decisions. But this is where, if we're talking about spinal reflexes, you can touch like a hot stove, and then you will naturally pull your hand off before you even start to feel the fact that you burned your fingertips, because that part of your nervous system is actively getting you to pull back from that stimuli before you're even able to make that a conscious thought, because we've effectively skipped steps. We've gone just to the spinal cord and straight back down, as opposed to the spinal cord and then up and through the different processing components of the body. So like anything else, it's all going to come down what we're trying to do. So spinal cord, we're talking about those real fast reflexes. Lower region, this is going to be kind of a quick righting ourselves, kind of balance a little bit, so to speak. And then obviously we've got our higher order thinking with our cerebral cortex into actually moving our body and trying to make obviously a consistent movement in whatever direction we're aiming for. So obviously the further we go up, the more complex we're going to have. And so a reflex is simply going to be something that's instant. It's pre-programmed, given a stimulus that's coming at us. Now, it's going to respond pretty much the same way each time. And this is before we even think about it. So this is maybe where you pulled your leg up real fast in front of you to keep yourself from falling. You've been scared and you maybe pulled your hands up to defend yourself out of reflex, or you took a swing at somebody out of reflex because you were concerned. And this is not a conscious decision. This is pure acting on reflex, these different pathways that are programmed into our mind. And a certain amount of sports is actually learning how to train those reflexes so that you're going to be able to react to those stimuli far faster than someone who has to consciously think about each decision they're making. Now, part of this is going to be influenced by our wonderful muscle spindles. Now, these are going to be around our fast and slow twitch fibers that happen to be deep inside of our muscle, and they're going to detect that stretch on the muscle. Now, when they detect that stretch on the muscle, they in turn are going to tell that muscle to contract. And this obviously contraction is going to allow us to get a bit stronger of a muscle contraction than we would have otherwise, because we are sending those excitatory graded potentials to our skeletal muscles to all the way getting an actual action potential. And we're going to see this whenever we do the vertical jump lab next week. And that's going to be another one where you guys are going to come in and do the jumping around. Now, this is good. We want our muscle spindles to fire because it keeps the muscle itself from being overstretched, and in turn that would cause it to tear. So this is why if you feel yourself, you actually feel your muscle when you're stretching your hamstrings, otherwise you feel tension in it. And that's actually because your muscle spindles are actually being activated, which in turn is having a little bit of tension and then more tension if you keep putting and applying more and more force to that muscle. Now, we then have our Golgi tendon organs, and this is where we are going to, in turn, be able to detect the stretch on the tendon. Now, this is obviously at the very ends, so the origin and the insertion. Now, when this feels the tendon being stretched too far, it's going to tell the muscle to relax, so that way we don't apply too much tension through the muscle, tearing the tendon. Now, with training, we're actually going to make these less sensitive, whereas we're going to make our muscle spindles more sensitive. So you're actually able to train and push more force through your tendons than you would have otherwise, which of course is now increasing your risk for injury, because now we're able to literally produce and receive forces far, far higher than we would otherwise. In fact, the reason I tore my pec is arguably because my Golgi tendon organs did not tell my pecs to shut down, and I applied more force than my tendon could take, and it tore it right off the bone. It's a unique sensation, but I know I have other students that have gone through it. If you ever want to hear about how it feels like, we can talk about it. So the alpha motor neuron, that's going to be the one that's sending it to those individual fibers that it innervates. Once it gets to those actual groups, so for fine motor control, which is typically more slow twitch, we're going to have far fewer fibers per motor unit. For gross, like power, jumping, sprinting, etc., we're going to recruit far more fibers per motor unit. And remember, guys, most of our fibers are going to be homogeneous for that motor unit. So we have our fast twitch motor neurons and we have our slow twitch motor neurons. And what we're going to find is literally training is going to start to see transitions a little bit more. Our type 2 can be more like our type 1, and our type 1s can be more like our type 2. Because like anything else, we want to have a certain amount of neurological plasticity, because when it comes to being human, you don't want to be too over specialized, because then you're not going to be able to obviously confront a lot more dynamic and changing environments. So now that's giving through the basics of the neurological side. We left off also talking about the joys of our wonderful sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of our nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is great when it comes to that fight or flight and we need to get something done. But it's where we want to spend very, very little of our time. It's very expensive to be in sympathetic states. It's hard to learn neurologically in that. It's hard to be, obviously you can't relax. You're going to be trying to obviously free up a lot of nutrients for performance, which is great if that's, the hard training otherwise you're going through. But the problem with it being is obviously you're not recovering whatsoever, and it's cutting into your recovery the more time you spend in sympathetic tone. Now, this means using relaxation techniques, breathing techniques, etc., are a way to break into the parasympathetic nervous system. In fact, slowing your breathing down, breathing nasally, is a method to actually get more parasympathetic tone. Whereas the sympathetic tone, that's breathing through your mouth, breathing more shallowly, and getting, you can amp yourself up and otherwise. Now, what's really cool is because of the huge amount of epinephrine you're dumping into the bloodstream, you're actually going to see lower blood flow to everyone in the body except for the exercising muscles. In fact, it can go high enough that literally people will suffer cuts and injuries and not really bleed from it until they relax, because then they have that vasodilation and now they have more blood flow to their skin, and then all of a sudden they start bleeding all over the place. And this is something that unfortunately it happens for people, police, fire, or otherwise, that when they go real hard in fight or flight, they can have auditory exclusion, meaning they don't really hear much. They can have tunnel vision where they can only see what's directly in front of them. And obviously it can lead people in these states to make less than optimal decisions because, for lack of a better term, we're shutting down our higher order thinking. We're just straight up trying to fight for our lives. And that's what causes people to make bad decisions. Now, the easiest example of this when it comes to sports is typically watching little kids play and then see like a little kid who falls on or just falls and collapses under the pressure. Have you ever seen a kid score on their own goal because they thought they were doing the right thing, because they happen to be so sympathetically amped up, they didn't even realize, oh, you're kicking the ball at your own goal and you're becoming disoriented. So it's just an important concept to keep in mind. If you want to learn more on that topic, I would always highly recommend reading the book On Combat by Dave Grossman. And that's a great text for going through and understanding all the things that are going to happen whenever people are in legitimately high stress environments. Any questions over the neurological side, how it changes, the importance of it, etc.? Any questions? All right, so since we don't have any questions, we're going into 5 groups. Each group will run a scenario where we'll say subject, patient, etc., that has had a traumatic brain injury to their group 1 is going to be frontal lobe. Group 2 is going to be the parietal lobe. Group 3, we're going to have the temporal lobe. Group 4 is going to be the occipital lobe. And then finally, group 5, you're going to have the, we'll go with the diencephalon. Now, questions, comments, concerns? I'm throwing this up in chat. We're going to go ahead and give you guys, it's 1:40 now. I'm going to give you guys to 1:50. So you guys have got 10 minutes to talk together, use the powers of the internet, look into all the different components of, thinking, cognition, etc., that are supposed to be localized to those areas, and how that in turn would influence someone who might be presenting with a brain injury in those areas. Questions, comments, concerns? All right, so I'm gonna put you guys in those groups. If you don't join the breakout room within, we'll just say a minute or two, I'm gonna throw you in the waiting room because I figure anyone that hasn't hopped in by then probably isn't listening to the lecture. They just signed in and walked away. And I'd rather you guys get more out of it than someone not taking the time to put in the effort. So have fun, guys. I'll see you guys back at 1:50. Yeah, big component being personality and impulse control. That's a big component of the prefrontal cortex. And it's interesting, and that isn't fully matured until you're in your 20s, which explains some of the decisions that people make. And actually, on a gender basis, guys, theirs tends to mature 2 years later on in life than women. Absolutely. Good job, Abby. And great point bringing up the realities of your occipital lobe is one of the three components of balance. So our vision is one, our vestibular sense inside of our ear, so that's part of the temporal, but then also it's the kinesthetics, the actual feeling, the touch receptors in your skin, hand, feet, or where that's going to give us information we're at, along with the kinesthetic receptors in the muscle spindle, Golgi tendon organs.
So all of my stuff just deleted off here, but we were group 5 and we had the diencephalon. So the diencephalon's function was to it was the primary relay and processing center for sensory information and autonomic control. So if that was damaged, there would be disruption in the flow of information from the brain to the body. And there was possible severe and long-term amnesia. And it could also cause disruptions between the body's control of blood pressure, appetite, breathing, body temp, just since there's that loss of connection. So
great job. Now, another long-term effect to keep in mind with the diencephalon, specifically talking the hypothalamus, is dysregulation of hormones. In fact, in my experience of working with folks that have had brain injuries, it's not unheard of to see some issues with hormonal abnormalities, typically meaning a lack of certain hormones. So this could be from your thyroid hormone, your sex hormones, your stress hormones, where they're not being produced to the level they should be because you've got damage to your hypothalamus. But great point on the processing. Yeah, and so great job, Colleen, because it turns out not just being able to speak is going to be a component there, but being able to just understand language where things are simply not going to process and make sense like they once did. Now, obviously, there's a difference between acute damage and then like legitimate chronic, like it's gone, it got scooped out or blown out. But it is important to understand that these are going to be influencing, obviously, quality of life. And so I think that's about, oh yes, and thank you, Randall. I didn't see your stuff there, but absolutely. So obviously issues with controlling the body and really just essentially taking in information of what's going on throughout the different regions. Nice. Now, we touched on the hippocampus briefly, and that's obviously the part of the brain where we're doing a lot of memory consolidation and building. So if you had a damage to the hippocampus, it turns out you are not going to have, you might not remember what happened to you, what caused the injury. You might have gaps in your memory, and obviously severe enough injuries, you might literally not be able to have anything more than simply working in short-term memory for the rest of your life. And then there's the wonderful amygdala, the fear center of the brain. And there's actually, this is a lady who had a brain injury, but she had a natural calcification effectively, essentially that caused her amygdala to not function. So she literally had no ability to feel afraid, which is a bad thing because, as much as people like to say they're not motivated by fear, that's a dirty lie. Like fear is what keeps us from doing a lot of stupid things all the time. And in fact, this lady had literally been held at gunpoint more than once in her life because things that the rest of us be like, nah, I'm not going to go talk to that person. She's like, okay, well, I guess we're going to be all right. There's one story that was interesting. She was at a gas station at 2 o'clock in the morning, and a guy in an alleyway yelled for her to come over there. And she's like, okay. 2 o'clock in the morning, gas station in an area of town that she's not used to. And she just decides, yeah, I'll go hang out with this person in the alleyway. Nothing can go wrong with that. And obviously she was mugged, held at gunpoint and everything else. And it doesn't really cause any trauma, so to speak, with her, because she doesn't process fear like you and I. But all of these regions of the brain obviously have important components. We don't fully understand how everything works together, how we're able to fully, think, learn, and everything else. We got the basics and understanding there, but it is important to keep in mind, we're all playing in this combat contact sport known as life. And so if you ever are lucky enough to, suffer concussion, it's important to understand that there's a lot of different features of the brain that can be disrupted. And that's obviously going to massively change how you're currently conducting yourself, how you're living your life. And so it's important to, agreed, understand that, so these different areas of the brain are specialized, but they all work in conjunction together. And if one area is not working correctly, there are going to be issues. In fact, whenever you see cops having people do a sobriety test, it's really just a test of cerebellum function. Can they walk in a line? Can they stand on one foot? And obviously that's going to be an indicator of how drunk they are, but obviously that can be another effect of, unfortunately suffering a brain injury. So questions, comments, concerns about the information that we have covered so far today when we're talking about the wonders of the brain and how it all works together. Questions, comments, concerns. Nope, all this stuff's pretty easy, straightforward. Ready to take all the quizzes? In what way do you want to run through each function? Yeah. So that's actually what you guys effectively went through with your brain injury part. So as in, frontal lobe, this is where we think of more like conscious thought, processing, making decisions and movements. So hence the prefrontal cortex for helping us make better decisions. Our temporal lobe, which is obviously a lot to do with our hearing, but then also processing auditory information, a little bit to be said about language here, but there's a lot of overlap with every part of the brain. Your parietal lobe is going to be incoming sensory information, and then obviously, figuring out what's going on as far as, touch receptors, pain, heat, cold, etc. The occipital lobe, which is mostly for processing, obviously visual information. Then we have that diencephalon, where we've got our thalamus and our hypothalamus. So thalamus being the major essential processor it's signaling, well, as you can see on the next one, where it relays information to the parts of the brain where it needs to go. And it's going to allow us to kind of have a little bit more of the shifting the attention where we want it. The hypothalamus, which is that master gland, which is maintaining our homeostasis or allostasis, depending on perspective. Inside of here, you'll also have your amygdala and your hippocampus, which hippocampus for the memory, amygdala for the fear center of the brain, our cerebellum, which is going to be for fine tuning, motor control and movement. So this can be balance, etc. Our pons medulla oblongata, we're talking about literally in our brainstem. Effectively, that's what's regulating breathing when you're not thinking about it, along with your resting heart rate. So yeah, that's kind of the nice, quick and dirty run through. Yes, in fact, I believe, great point there, Evan, that Alex Honnold, he actually did have a brain scan done, and his amygdala doesn't hardly fire at all compared to your average person. He's the guy that did the free climbing of Big Sur. is it Yellowstone or Yosemite National Park? Either way, it's insane because he literally climbed up over, I think, a vertical mile with literally nothing more than a chalk bag and rock climbing shoes. Don't get me wrong, he trained for it for a while, he practiced for it for a while, but he is obviously very comfortable with taking part in free climbing, which is a sport that doesn't have a great survival rate. But you know, that's where some folks are literally wired differently. And another thing to keep in mind is, you know, if one area of the brain is damaged, other areas of the brain tends to try to take over some of those responsibilities, along with, you know, individuals that are obviously blind. You know, what would be the signal processing for vision isn't quite happening like it once was. So there's a little bit more with processing, obviously, sound information and other sensory information in their minds over a long enough period of time, because brains are plastic. They change with time. You are obviously learning not just mental skills through you being in school, but you're also hopefully still learning some physical skills because you're participating in sports, you're being physically active. And that is a great thing because it allows your brain to obviously change and get better at what we do more frequently. The problem is your body is adapting to all the demands placed upon it based upon what you're doing. So if all you're doing is getting your brain better at spinning the wheel on, you know, some form of social media, you're doing a good job at learning how to pay attention to less, how to stare at something really close to yourself, and to be constantly searching for that dopamine hit, which is obviously not a great long-term strategy for your own mental health, much less overall physical health. So you have to keep in mind everything that you're asking your body to do, your body's going to try and get better at. So if you just like to sit all day, your body's getting better at sitting. It's doing a better job of laminating and flattening out the muscles of your butt and your hamstrings because they don't get used. So who cares? We can have them be in a crummy state because there's no real demand for them to be used. So do keep in mind the joys of living. You're welcome, because all social media does is typically make you feel worse about yourself. Nothing like seeing everybody else's highlight reel to make you feel inadequate. No, but just obviously, like anything else, be deliberate with how you're living your life, because it's easy to do what other people are telling you to do. So, questions, comments, concerns about the neurological system before we're going to go ahead and don't want to move on, but instead we're going to give you guys another little for fun thing for you guys to do. Anything else neurologically you guys would like to ask questions on? They're kind of like, we like a free safety, but you can obviously use the power of Google to learn even more about it pretty rapidly. Then let's go. That's a pretty darn good approach. Keep looking into information. I had a question from one of the students. What's the best way to study for the quiz? Go through the lecture notes. You can rewatch the lectures, go through and read what you've written down, look at the slides, and then look at your book. And then, like anything else, try to figure out what you're missing. Is it a knowledge application question, or is it more of your ability to just memorize information? And that can give you some information of where you guys are going to go. So go ahead, guys. We're going to put you guys back into the breakout rooms. And I want you guys to go ahead and answer that, how much type 2A, 2X, and type 1 fiber they have. Think about the different areas of the body and how that's going to be influencing it, along with, obviously, what are going to be the major energy sources that they happen to be using for that endeavor. So have fun. We're going to come back at like 2:12, 2:13, just post in wherever you guys came up with. Get after it. All right, guys, when you're ready, go ahead and paste in what you guys came up with. No wrong answers, but we're going to talk through what you guys came up with. And then I've got one other random ask/opportunity for you guys, just for fun, that we can go ahead and talk through. So go ahead. Whoa, Lexi. Those midfielders got to be able to do cardio all day up and down that field. So we're going to see probably a lot more type 1. And typically, it's very rare for any of you guys to see anybody that's got over 10, much less 20% type 2X fibers. The people that have the highest amount of type 2X fibers are usually sedentary people, which is kind of weird, but that's actually how it works physiologically. Okay. Okay, good job, Holly. I probably messed it up again. Sorry about that. But that you would want to have a greater amount of lower body. Holly, thank you. Have a greater amount of type 1 in the lower body compared to the upper body, just from the nature of moving around. That's okay. That's okay, Lexi. That's why we talk through these things. And yeah, the midfielder would definitely be using a lot more aerobic glycolysis for their sport, a little bit of anaerobic. Okay, so nice. Nice, Randall. And the only thing is I would say on top of that is if the team's bad, the goal is going to have to be more aerobic. But obviously the team's really good. Hopefully it's just a lot of ATP PCR and then otherwise beta oxidation just standing around. Yes, great job, because it is like essentially a rugby or a flag football where it keeps going. So it has more of an aerobic component, just like soccer. So you're going to have a better aerobic motor for doing that. Good points. Now for the back in rugby, you're probably going to see closer to about 60 to 70% 2A. Guys, 2X is incredibly rare. You don't see it in a lot of people, except for the most sedentary individuals and then like Usain Bolt's, like your world's best and fastest athletes. So you're typically going to see a greater amount of 2A and then a lesser amount of type 1. And then type 2X, because they call them actually couch potato fibers, they're going to be the lowest and well-trained individuals. So that's going to be something that's typically way less than 10% for anyone that really gets after it. In fact, high-level athletes in Olympic lifting, whether they were biopsied, didn't even show any type 2X fibers except for the one that literally just came back from taking a couple-week layoff. Now, the last component, and then obviously feel free, guys, if you got to get going, you got to get going. I'm going to be interviewing Greg Knuckles in bioenergetics, but it's going to serve more purposes than obviously just for bioenergetics. I'm going to talk to him some questions about phys and biomechanics and everything else. What questions would you guys like to ask him? He is the owner of Stronger by Science. He's a pretty accomplished power lifter and just is a very, very great mind in the more kind of pop world of strength conditioning and performance. So if there's any questions that you'd be interested and asking him, just go ahead and shoot me an email with that question, because I'm just kind of putting together a list that I'm going to go ahead and hopefully be able to get to go through with him whenever we chat, literally tomorrow night. So, because that's worked out for his schedule. So we're going to make it work. So any other questions, comments, concerns? So I'm going to go ahead and hit stop and record. You guys stay safe out there and have a great day.